Welcome to the Well Path podcast, where we sit down with experts and entrepreneurs across fitness, nutrition, mindfulness, and spirituality, offering you an inside peek at building a business and a life that is truly aligned. I'm your host, Brooke Robbins. Let's get into it. Hi, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of the Well Path podcast. I'm your host, Brooke Robbins. And before we dive in, I just wanted to take a second to say, if you enjoy the podcast, please consider rating and reviewing us on whatever platform you're listening or watching on: Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube. It really helps the show grow. Also, you can follow me on Instagram at Brooke Robbins. I love hearing comments and suggestions from you guys on future topics for future weeks. So looking forward to connecting with some of you guys there. Without further ado, I want to introduce today's topic, which is one of my favorite topics, actually, which is the topic of self-trust. And this theme has kind of come up for me a lot in the last couple of months in conversations with friends. I've seen the word trust around a lot. And I had a conversation with a friend of mine who's a little bit younger, so in her early 20s, last week. And it was just a reminder for me of how common this experience is of being in your 20s and not really feeling like you have that. And I think sometimes when we lack self-trust, it can manifest as sort of a lack of direction or feeling really stagnant or really confused. And I was reflecting back on my 20s. I'm 29 now, and thinking about how much I feel like I've grown in this department and how radically it's transformed my life. So I knew it was something that I wanted to bring to the podcast. And then actually this weekend, I had a really cool interaction that kind of brought the topic back home for me. And that's actually why I'm recording this episode today, because I was like, okay, now I really need to talk about this. And basically, this interaction was with somebody that I really admire. This person is extremely well-known, extremely successful entrepreneur. She has a massive global audience. I'm talking 15, 16 million people. And she's incredibly accomplished. And I had the opportunity to meet this person this weekend. And the craziest thing was, this person basically specifically commented on my confidence and said something along the lines of what do you do because you're so confident and you show up so confidently? And this interaction really had me reflecting for a couple of days afterwards of what is that, right? What is it that somebody picks up on and is you're really confident? What is that energy? And if you know me, you know that I believe that everything is energy. That's why when you walk into a room, if the vibes are off, you can feel that the vibes are off, even if nobody has said anything. Or if you walk into a room and the vibes are really good, you can feel that, or you can feel chemistry between people. Everything is energy. And confidence is also an energy. And as I was reflecting on, what is it that makes somebody confident, or that makes somebody even appear confident? And that's how other people kind of translate that and pick it up. And for me, everything comes back to the same root of self-trust. Self-trust is a prerequisite to actually showing up and self-expressing authentically. And I believe that when people perceive confidence in somebody, what they're actually picking up on is somebody who is really comfortable in their own skin, who is really just being themselves and is being 100% authentic and is showing up exactly as they are. And that's also the same thing as when you talk about somebody who's very magnetic. When you meet somebody or are around somebody who you feel really drawn to, that's usually because that person is just fully embracing who they are and is completely being themselves and is completely comfortable to just be themselves and show up exactly as they are. And so that's what we're going to talk about today, is this concept of self-trust, what it is, and more importantly, how to build it. And to start, I want to actually just quickly go through some signs and symptoms that might indicate to you that this is a good growth area for you. And again, it's very normal. I mean, I think most people throughout most of their 20s are kind of figuring this component out. It's not something that necessarily you just always have innately. I'm sure some people do, but it's for most of us something that we have to actually take action and create habits to grow in. So the first sign that you might have a self-trust problem, and this might be something that you want to work on, is that you outsource a lot of your decisions. So this is something I did a lot in my early and I would say even mid 20s. I struggled a lot to trust my own decision making. So I would often go to friends, go to family, go to my therapist, basically try to ask for as many opinions as possible on the decisions that I would make, honestly, like big and small. And while in some cases it's okay to ask certain people for advice, first of all, I believe you should be very discerning about who you're asking advice from. So the way that I think about this is you should only ask somebody for advice in a specific category if you would want to live the way that they're living in that category. And again, it's like nobody's, perfect. There's like different components of this. But for example, you shouldn't ask relationship advice from somebody who's not in a relationship that you admire. You shouldn't ask career advice from somebody who's not in a career that you admire. You shouldn't ask for like friendship advice from somebody who like doesn't have strong friendships. So I think first of all, like if you're somebody who kind of asks everybody for advice and are not necessarily the most discerning about who you're asking for advice, that's one thing. And also just in general, if you find that you put more weight on what other people's opinions are of the decisions that you make than how you actually feel, then that's a really good indicator that you probably want to work on your own self-trust and tuning into your own intuition in decision making. The second kind of red flag, if you will, from a self-trust perspective is if you're somebody who, after making a decision, spends time considering reneging on that decision. And I'll give you some examples again from my life. I used to do this all the time, even with small things. And travel was a big one. So if I was planning a solo trip, which I've done so many times, and that's why this is kind of funny, but I used to drive myself crazy actually planning my own trips because, for example, let's say I was like, okay, I am going to go to Japan and I have 5 days to spend in Japan. I can either spend all 5 days in Tokyo, or I can spend 3 days in a new city like Osaka and then go to Tokyo for 2 days. And I would like agonize over the decision in the first place. I would go back and forth, and then I would finally make a decision. Say I decided, okay, I'm going to go to Tokyo so I don't feel rushed. As soon as I would book that flight, within like a 24-hour period, I would start thinking, oh, was that the right decision? Maybe I should go to Osaka. And I would think about all the things that could happen if I went to Osaka. And then I would start like looking up like, oh, what's the change fee to change the flight? How expensive would it be to change my decision? And I would go through this entire exercise of like going through the pros and cons again after making the decision. This is a big red flag, but it's also normal. I don't want you to think that you're not normal if you do this, but it's just a sign again that you really struggle to commit to your decisions. And that's just a sign that you need to work on this concept of self-trust and trusting the decisions that you make. The third sign is if you're just generally riddled with anxiety, particularly around decision making, or feel a general lack of direction. These could be signs that you don't trust yourself and or are not connected to your intuition and your inner knowing of what you should be doing in every moment. And then I think too, and this is something I hear a lot from like friends and people that I talk to that are in their earlier 20s, and I can relate to this from my own past as well, feeling like a general lack of direction. So if you feel like you struggle to take your own decisions in life, and by the way, like one way this can manifest is kind of like orientating yourself around a partner or around something external to you. Or it could just be that in general, you feel like you don't know what you want to do with your life, or you don't know like what steps to take, or you don't know what you want to do next. Feeling kind of lost is also another sign that you haven't really connected to that inner wisdom within you. And we're going to talk about how to start doing that in this episode. And that's going to be the next portion of this. So with all of that being said, if you're listening to this and any of these things feel like they apply to you, building your self-trust is obviously like a lifelong journey. It doesn't really like have a start and an end date, but I do believe that you can really build this up over time. And it's like the gift that will keep giving. So how do you actually build self-trust if you don't already have a strong foundation for it? The first thing that you can do, and this is actually a piece of advice that I got from a friend of mine who's a little bit older than me several years ago, was to basically take note of your intuition's track record. So you're going to want to take a pen and paper or whatever, write it on your notes app, but actually take a second in the quiet of your own mind to reflect back on past experiences where you had a really strong gut feeling about something. And
just write those down. Just write down like all of these experiences that you had where you had a really strong gut feeling about that. And then for each of those, reflect on, did you listen to the gut feeling or did you not listen to the gut feeling? And do this without shame. By the way, when I did this exercise, it was like almost all of them were like, had the gut feeling, didn't listen to the gut feeling. That's okay. The purpose of this exercise is to kind of like bring to the forefront so you can see it with your own two eyes your intuition's track record, and kind of it's like actually starting to prove to yourself that you have an intuition, you have felt that intuition even if you haven't listened to it in the past, and probably the track record is really, really good. So what are the instances that you can recall in your life where you had a really strong gut feeling about something? Did you listen to it or did you not listen to it? And then what happened? So if you listened to it, what happened? If you didn't listen to it, what happened? And again, do this like without attaching any judgment to it. Just like treat it like you're just literally running a history, and think about that and look at that. And most likely you're going to find that you do have a very strong intuitive feeling about certain things, and you have had that in the past, and probably the track record is really, really good. I don't know if this will resonate with anybody who's listening, but for me, for example, when I kind of started going down this path of trying to reconnect to my intuition and develop this like self-trust in a bigger way, I was somebody who genuinely believed that I was disconnected from my intuition. And I felt like I didn't have an intuition, or I couldn't tap into my intuition. And this exercise really helped to just show me that that was completely untrue. I think for a lot of us, we might feel disconnected from our intuition because we're not in the habit of actually listening to our intuition, but it doesn't mean that it's not there. And oftentimes we have received kind of signals from our gut or wherever you're feeling your intuition in the past. We just haven't been in the habit of actually listening to that, and we've overridden those messages with logic or other things. This is really like step one, is just take note of your intuition's track record. And step two is tune into the feeling of that. So now you've basically done this recall of all of these moments where you had a strong gut feeling about something. And the question that I want to ask you now is, where do you feel your gut? Where do you feel your intuition? Because I think this phrase, trust your gut, can actually be kind of confusing, because not everybody experiences their intuition as a literal gut feeling. Personally, I do. My intuition does sit in my gut, but it doesn't for everybody. And that's kind of interesting. So as you're going through this kind of exercise of recalling all of these moments in the past, take a second to ask yourself and like kind of try to embody the feeling of what it was, right? So you're in this kind of memory and try to like feel it. Like, where does your intuition sit within your body? Is it a feeling, first of all? And if so, like, where does it live? Is it like a voice that you hear in your head, like telling you what to do? Like, what is it when you experience this kind of like inner knowing? Where does it live? And one thing that I will mention is there's something called human design, which I'm not going to go down that rabbit hole today, although we could potentially do another episode on it at another point. But human design is a very interesting tool that might be helpful to some of you guys for identifying where you can actually feel your intuition. So if you're interested in that, Google it. I really like the app called My Human Design by Jenna Zoe. If you're interested to explore that, go for it. If you're not, just move on. But either way, if you don't want to go down that rabbit hole, you can just, again, try to embody yourself in these past moments as past moments or past experiences, and try to remember like where you actually feel your gut feeling. And then you're going to spend time putting yourself back into that space. So develop a consistent meditation practice. This is really, really key. And I know I've spoken about meditation like 5 million times in this podcast, and I'm probably going to talk about it 5 million more times because meditation is an incredible tool, because our intuition sits underneath all of the other thoughts and feelings and emotions and other things that kind of happen in our day-to-day life. And meditation is like a massive windshield wiper that just like clears all of the gook on top so that you can actually see what's underneath it. And it's the best way to actually get in touch with your intuition. If you feel like you're disconnected from your intuition, this is the best way to start to hear and feel your intuition again, is by developing a consistent meditation practice, because you're going to be giving yourself more and more time every day to actually tune into that so that you can hear it without all of the distraction of all of these thoughts. So develop a consistent meditation practice and spend time actually meditating again on this feeling of like, where do I feel this knowing? Where is it in my body? How does it present for me? Okay, so we have take note of your intuition's track record, tune into that feeling, and try to do that consistently through a meditation practice. The third thing that we can do is start keeping promises to ourselves. Self-trust and self-love go hand in hand. You can't really have one without the other. And it's really important to start to signal to yourself that you can rely on you. And this is, again, part of trusting yourself, that you can rely on you and that you have your own back. And okay, I'm still kind of deciding how much of my personal life I'm sharing on the podcast on a week to week. And I'm going to keep it kind of broad for right now. And maybe at a later point, I'll share more on the podcast. But for me, I will say I've recently had to make some really big, really difficult and very scary decisions in my life. And I'm fully convinced that the only reason I was able to make those decisions and have been able to make those decisions is because I had this track record of like a year and a half of really, really looking after myself. So for the last year and a half, I have really just focused on building the self-trust and actually leaning into self-love, not in the like bubble baths, like Hallmark kind of way, but in actually consistently showing up for myself. I got my fitness right. I really committed to like a really strong fitness routine. I started cooking for myself, nourishing my body with really good food. I started sleeping with my phone outside of my bedroom. So I'm like not scrolling at night or in the morning. And I have like peace in my mind when I go to sleep and when I wake up. So there's all these kind of micro habits, meditating every day, that I committed to myself and that I followed through on, which again, we're just like this combination of proof points of like, I have my back, I'm looking after me. And in addition to that, you start to naturally build more confidence because you feel yourself becoming a better version of you. You feel yourself becoming somebody that you admire and that you respect. And so I think it's really, really important to start keeping promises to yourself, because these little micro habits that you commit to and that you show up for yourself on a day-to-day basis are going to pave the way for you to show up for yourself in the big ways later. So that's really a big one. So start making promises to yourself. It doesn't have to be these big grand things, although it can be, but you can start with like, okay, for a week, I'm going to commit to waking up 30 minutes earlier and doing a 10-minute meditation. Or for a week, I'm going to commit to 20 minutes of movement every single day, and like do it and follow through for yourself. Do it for you. And just start, again, building this track record of keeping promises to yourself. And that is going to signal to your brain and to your mind and to your heart that you have your back. The last component of trusting yourself is trusting the process and embracing sort of like a big picture thinking. So for a second, I want you to zoom out and think about an instance in your life where you didn't get what you thought you wanted. That could be a relationship didn't work out that you thought you really wanted to work out. Maybe you like didn't get into a specific program or a school or something, or you like didn't get accepted into something that you thought you wanted to do. And then kind of like ask yourself this question of like, in the end, seeing how everything panned out, was that really for my highest good actually? Because usually when we zoom out and we look at the bigger picture, we realize that a lot of the things that we thought we wanted wouldn't have worked out for us anyway. And God, the universe, whatever you kind of believe in, your higher power, actually was guiding you in exactly the way that you needed to be guided. You just didn't have the full picture at the time. And in hindsight, you can see why everything happened the way that it did. Now, for me, surrendering to the process and surrendering to the current moment in the recognition that there's a bigger picture at play that I can't yet see is very much linked to my faith and my connection to a higher power. I'm a spiritual person, and sometimes spirituality is going to come out on this podcast. It's not meant to be preachy, but I'm just sharing, for me personally, this is very much rooted in my connection to a higher power. For me, that's God. For you, it might be something else. But irregardless of your beliefs, faith in the bigger picture is the foundation of trust and surrendering to the flow of life, which is also, as we've discussed previously, the foundation of confidence and the ability to show up authentically in exactly who you are. you have to trust in the flow of life and you have to trust in the process in order to sometimes make it over to the other side on some big decisions. And again, in order to live courageously and live boldly, this is like what I kind of say is like the cost of an interesting life is wading through fear and uncertainty. And actually brings me to the last point that I want to make. So we've kind of talked about some tactical things that you can do to start building your self-trust. There's one last point, which is more like a framework of how I think about decisions. And this is a realization that I had actually relatively recently. This is a realization that came to me in the last couple of weeks because, as I mentioned to you guys, I have recently had to make some really massive decisions, kind of like one after the other, because they're interrelated. And as I was kind of preparing to make the second decision, I was reflecting on the first big decision that I made and like what the process was for me in making that decision. And the realization that I had is that for me, in every big decision that I've made in my life so far, I have never felt 100% certain and 100% ready in the moment. Hindsight is 2020. 2020 vision is perfect vision, right? There's this saying like hindsight's 2020. Often in hindsight, after we've made the leap and come out on the other side, we can see things clearly. But in the moment when you're standing at the precipice and about to make a huge decision, things rarely feel that clear. But this is where this foundation of self-trust comes in. So if you accept that at most you're going to feel about 80% ready, the work is really getting familiar with what that 80% feels like, and then developing enough trust in yourself that you can stomach the 20% of uncertainty, the 20% of fear, the 20% of anxiety that goes with that, so that you actually have the courage to take the leap in whatever you're doing. And another thing that I want to just call out as we're talking about kind of the 80-20 rule and kind of standing on the precipice of big decisions, because this also goes to the core of trusting yourself, is that sometimes taking kind of a bold action to change something in your life feels a lot scarier than keeping things the way that they are. However, we have to remember that everything is a decision, and indecision is also a decision. So in other words, if you were to choose to not change anything in your life, that's also a decision. It might feel less scary in the moment, but it comes with its own risks and rewards, just like taking that leap, whatever that leap is for you, is going to entail. So we have to kind of keep that in mind, that first of all, everything is a decision, indecision is a decision, and decision is a decision. So no matter what choice you're taking, you're making a decision. And this is also why building this foundation of self-trust is so important, because you can't get around that. Okay. Everybody has to make decisions in their life, and it's just an inevitability. So building this sense of self-trust is going to allow you to do that with a lot more clarity and a lot more calm and peace and inner peace. And again, I want to just highlight this 80-20 rule, because if you are always waiting to feel 100% certain, you will never take bold action and you will never actually move out of whatever situation that you're currently in. And so I don't want people to get confused that self-trust means feeling 100% certain about everything you do. It's not, it's an illusion. And maybe there are some superhuman people out there that feel 100% certain about things that they're doing in the moment, but I'm certainly not one of them. Usually you can feel 100% certain again in retrospect, but in the moment, don't hold out this expectation that you're going to feel 100% certain about anything. Focus your energy on building the self-trust so that you know you can take a bet on yourself. And also over time, start to familiarize yourself with what that 80% feels like, because that's kind of the moment that you know, even if you don't feel 100% ready, it's the right time to take that leap. And that concludes our episode for today. Thank you so much for being here. Please don't forget to rate and review the podcast if you have a moment on whatever platform that you're listening right now. Follow me on Instagram at Brooke Chapin Robbins. I love hearing from you guys. If you have any topics or things that you want covered in future episodes, please let me know. I love hearing your feedback, and I will see you next week.